Parshas VaYechi and other dimensions of the Shvatim in the Meshech Chochma. We begin with the beginning of Parshas VaYechi. VaYechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim. Ha'inyan she'ha'adam yesh echad shechai li'atzmo v'gam zeh tov v'yesh echai libnei beiso v'yesh echai li'iro yesh echai l'chol ha'olam. So there's some people, says Rabbi Simcha, who live for themselves. Others live for their family. Others live for the city. And others for the entire world. Valzen Nemar, Pasuk in Mishlei, V'tzadik Yisod Olam. Now, before we go on, let's open up Rashi at the beginning of Parshas VaYechi, and that'll give us a little bit of an entry here into the parsha. Rashi says, Lama parsha zu stuma, lefi shekevan sheniftar Yaakov Avinu nistemu eineim belibam shel Yisrael mitzaras hashibud cheschilu l'shabdam. So after the death of Yaakov Avinu, the eyes of Bnei Yisrael were closed, and that's a metaphor for the shibud and the tzaros that they would suffer from. Yaakov wanted to reveal the kates, the nistam mimenu, and it was removed from him. It was concealed. So that we have two interpretations of Rashi as to why this parsha is stuma. And one interpretation is stuma, a closed parsha, that the Eineim Shel Yisrael stumos. The other interpretation is Bikesh Yaakov, Legal Saketz Labanov, Vinistam Mimenu. Now, what this means is that a Parsha Stuma, which we'll find not just here but elsewhere, is a Parsha where there's no extra space between this Parsha and the preceding Parsha. So one Parsha flows right into the other Parsha without any space. Now we're ready for the Meshech Chochma. He writes the following: Yaakov Avinu lo be'iro levad hayachai. Yaakov Avinu was not limited to his city, meaning living on behalf of his city. V'lo le'eretz Goshen levad. He wasn't living only on behalf of Eretz Goshen. Rak b'chol Eretz Mitzrayim. He was living on behalf of the entire nation of Mitzrayim. That's why the Torah opens up with VaYechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim. Hainu, what is the relationship between Yaakov? What impact does Yaakov have on Eretz Mitzrayim? Shepasak hara'av miMitzrayim, when Yaakov stands in the presence of Paro and blesses Paro, then the famine terminated 5 years prematurely. And the bracha of Yaakov for Paro was Sheyala Haya'or Bishvilo, that the Nile will rise for Paro. And this is all based on a Tanchuma. Yaakov kishaholach etzel Paro lo yotza me'etzlo ad shebircho uma bircho omer lo sheyala nilus liragla. So the Nile River would rise for Paro. That was the bracha of Yaakov. V'zel shomer aval kaved avel kaved zeb Mitzrayim. Why is it that the entire nation of Mitzrayim was moved to grief over the loss of Yaakov? Below Eretz Goshen Bilvad, we would have anticipated al pipshat that only the Jewish nation in Eretz Goshen would have appreciated and mourned over the loss of Yaakov. But here it's Avel Kaved b'Mitzrayim, the entire Mitzrayim. And why is this so? Says Rabbi Simcha, this is based on a Sifri. Shechazar hara'av limkomo achar p'tirasa. Immediately following the death of Yaakov, the famine returned. And the language of Rav Asi in the Sifri, Kevan Shemes Yaakov Chazar Harav Liyosh Shenemar And Ravasi proves it from the pasuk Al Tiru Anochi Achalkel Eschem. In other words, they were already nervous, and Yosef tried to console them and calm them down. Lachein, here's the Chiddush of Rabbi Simcha. Rabbeinu HaKadosh Kari Nafshe, in the Yerushalmi Meshech Ksubis, Rabbeinu HaKadosh called about himself, V'chaye Yehuda Yud Zayin Shana B'tzipori. Right? Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is talking about himself in third person, that the life of Yehuda in Tzipori is 17 years of his life. Hainu Shemian Venuso Hiktin Kvodo She'eno Chai Rak B'tzipori. It was an act of modesty on Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's part to indicate that he only lived for Tzipori. That's not really true. MS, and the real truth is, from the eulogy of Rabbi Chanina, following the death of Rebbe, we could tell that he had an impact on the entire land of Israel. Oy lachem ubro sheveretz Yisrael. All over Eretz Yisrael, woe to us. Wow. Haresha kvodo higin al kol Eretz Yisrael. Wow. Rav Yehuda Nasi had an impact on the entire land of Israel. So when he speaks about Yud Zayin Shana B'tzipor, that's only a matter of modesty. He's hiding and concealing his greatness. B'zeu sharoach Yosef ki meis aviem. The pasuk says that the brothers of Yosef became aware of the death of their father. Hainu, how did they become aware of the death of his father? Shechaza arav l'makomo, because the famine returned. So this is tzaddik yisod olam. The tzaddik has an impact on the entire world. Ukemaimar asifri beparshas Ekev, lachein yiru yaru mipnei Yosef. That's why the brothers were afraid of Yosef, because the famine had returned. And maybe Yosef would refuse, following the death of father Jacob, to support them and sustain them. So it wasn't really as much that they were afraid that Yosef would avenge the sale of Yosef as a slave, but rather they were afraid of the impact of the drought and the famine. Would Yosef continue to support them and sustain them? So let's just make a few comments here about Reb Meir Simcha. Reb Meir Simcha his curiosity is piqued by the word VaYechi. It should have been VaYehi Yaakov Eretz Mitzrayim, and Yaakov was in Mitzrayim. What does it mean? He lived in Eretz Mitzrayim. And although it says Eretz Mitzrayim, which is technically correct, in other words, he did live the last part of his life in Eretz Mitzrayim. But Reb Meir Simcha is bothered. Why didn't the Torah get more specific? And he lived his life 17 years at the end of his life in Goshen. Says the Meshech Chochma, this is a subtle message that Yaakov had an impact on all of Eretz Mitzrayim. VaYechi Yaakov, his Chaim, his Chiyus, VaYechi, during this period of 17 years, has an impact on all of Mitzrayim. It gave life to Mitzrayim. So that even amongst the great people, you could find that those live on different levels, some only for their families, some for their cities, and some for the entire world. Those who live, meaning they breathe, they eat, they sleep, everything they do, they are concerned for themselves, others are concerned for their families, others live for their city, and rarely we find a select few that live their lives for everyone, for the entire world around them. And this, according to Rabbi Simcha, is the chiddush of our pasuk that Yaakov Avinu belongs to that last group, the highest group of those who are tzaddik yisod olam. They live on behalf of the olam, and they have a sincere interest in the entire globe, the entire world. In this case, Yaakov Avinu having an influence beyond himself and the immediate family, the circle of his family and his city, meaning Eretz Goshen, but rather he had the interest in the entire land and his heart, Jew and non-Jew alike. And that's what Tzaddik Yisod Olam means, the righteous one to a concern for the entire world. And their zchuyot, their merits, are the foundation of the entire world. And that's what the Tanchum is telling us about Yaakov's zechusim. It was so powerful that the famine, which was supposed to last for many more years, nevertheless terminated prematurely with the arrival of Yaakov to Mitzrayim. And it's not only for his family in Goshen, but it's for all of Mitzrayim. VaYechi Yaakov, the Eretz Mitzrayim, means that for the last 17 years he lived to help everyone in the land of Mitzrayim. And Rabbi Simcha adds an insight here as to why, now we have an answer, why the people in Mitzrayim were so grieved by the loss of Yaakov Avinu. After all, why would they react to the loss of someone from Eretz Canaan that doesn't seem to have any impact on Mitzrayim? But the answer is that because of Yaakov's chusim, that gave Mitzrayim prosperity, blessing. The Nile would rise for Paro. The hunger would only return after the death of Yaakov Avinu. And Rabbi Simcha says that the word zeh in this pasuk, let's just read it inside. It says, Avel zeh, this was a particular kind of avelus. And when a tzaddik dies, we lose that schus that he had. On the other hand, when a tzaddik dies, Chazal say, misas tzaddikim mechaperes, it causes and brings an atonement for people. So let's just read the last part of Rabbi Simcha to finish up this presentation. He says, Od yesh lomar, another reason why the death of Yaakov generated such a heavy grief and mourning over all of Mitzrayim, the Yadua de Kever Tzadik Mechape, the death of a tzaddik and his burial brings kapara atonement. Yirmiyahu Navi, as the Medrash describes it at the beginning of Eicha, Amala Kodesh Baruch Hu Yirmiyahu Navi, Lech v'kara liAvraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov u'Moshe mikivreim shem yodim livkos, that even the deceased can cry on behalf of the nations of the world. V'kever Moshe mechaper al avon pi'ar. That's a Gemara in Sota on Daf Yudalid. Hainu she'masha'ein hakever Mitzrayim b'daiku zeh, and you can be daik from the word zeh. So in other words, Rabbi Simcha is explaining that everyone is aware of the fact that when a tzaddik dies, there's an atonement, there's a great kapara for those people who remain alive. Now, Yaakov was not interred in Mitzrayim. And in Eretz Canaan, they realized that Yaakov was being brought up Eretz Canaan for burial, and they were able to point Zeh to his grave, Zeh. And this means that Mitzrayim was mourning because of the loss of the kapara, what we call the protection posthumously of the kever, the body of a tzaddik. Had Yaakov's body remained in Mitzrayim, then it would have protected, just like Moshe Rabbeinu was buried near Pa'ar to protect us as an atonement for the sin of Baal Pa'ar. Yaakov, had he been buried in Mitzrayim, would have protected Mitzrayim. But that's not how it was meant to be. Yaakov was meant to be born, to be buried in Canaan. The people in Canaan would benefit from the kever of Yaakov in Eretz Canaan. Of course, Rabbi Simcha is not satisfied with just that. He has to add an explanation for the reaction of Yosef's brothers. After the mourning period concluded, it says, "Vayiru achei Yosef," the brothers saw, "Kimei savir, vayomru lu yistamenu Yosef." Yosef will nurse hatred against us. What rekindled their fear that Yosef would take revenge against them? Had Yosef treated them differently? Says Rameir Simcha, no. When they saw that the famine returned to the land of Mitzrayim, they realized that it was their father's presence during his lifetime, his influence. And now that influence would no longer protect them. And they mistakenly felt that Yosef would now be free to take retribution for their behavior towards him. All he had to do, Yosef, was to cease supplying them and sustaining them, because now the famine was back to where it was following the death of Yaakov Avinu. So this is all a presentation of Rabbi Simcha at the very beginning of Parshat VaYechi, emphasizing the word VaYechi. Now, as I mentioned at the outset, Parshat VaYechi addresses many of the Shvatim. In fact, I think I could say with accurate measurement that it relates to all of the Yud Beis Shvatim. And I thought it would be perhaps a good opportunity to talk to you about some of the insights of Rameir Simcha to the various Shvatim. Now, in the second piece in Parshas VaYechi, Vayishtachu Yisrael Arosh Hamita, Rameir Simcha points out that Avru Rov Shnosa V'lo Chata Shuv Lo Yechte. He makes a calculation. Yosef lived till 110. Half of 110 is 55. And he was 30 years old when he stood in front of Paro. 7 years of Sova had passed, and 2 years of Ra'ah, of famine. That totals for 9. Now, if you add 30 to 9, you get 39. So Paro, he stood in front of Paro at the age of 30. 9 years had passed, and now Yaakov Avinu lives in the land for 17 years. So if we add 17 to 39, we get 56. Is that correct? Let me just double check that. I think I checked that before, but let me just do it again. We have 39 plus 17. Just 1 second. Where did I mess up here? We have to add 37 plus 17 plus 2. And then we get to 56. And since Yosef died at the age of 110, then already 56 years, which is the majority of his life, had passed. And we have a principle that Avru Rov Shnosa V'lo Chata Shuv Lo Yichta, Gemara in Yoma. So therefore, says Rabbi Simcha, that adds another element to the equation about the greatness of Yosef, that he didn't sin, and that's why Yaakov Avinu bowed, so to speak, to his son Yosef. And let's take a look for a moment at Bereshis Lamed Beis Pasuk Vav. Now, I'm juggling a lot of Sfarim here, And unfortunately, I don't have enough place to put them. And I have the computer here too for the Zoom chair. Let's see if I can possibly do this. Okay. We'll try and see what we can do. So bear with me a little bit. And I want to point out to you a presentation, a very short presentation of Rav Meir Simcha. If you want to open up to Bereshis Lamed Beis, Pasuk Vav. I'll just read it to you very quickly because we want to move on. He says, Lachein kasher liyosid yitukan cheto shel Yehuda, yiskayim v'aryeh kibakar yochal teven. Now, obviously, this pasuk is a metaphor, and it is a prophecy about Yehuda, comparing him to the Aryeh, which we'll see in the bracha here in VaYechi, that Yaakov bestows upon Yehuda. He's a lion, and he will eat teven. Teven is straw. Usually a lion doesn't eat straw, so this is all a metaphor. Kib bakar. What does this mean? Says the Rav Meir Simcha, Yehuda yochal beis Esa. Interesting. That this concept of kib bakar yochal teven, again, this is part of a longer presentation of Rav Meir Simcha, is symbolic of Esav. And we always assume that it is the descendants of Yosef who will destroy the enemies, Esav, but Rav Meir Simcha says, based on the prophecy of Yirmiyah, that the descendants of Yehuda would decimate the adversaries, the enemies of Klal Yisrael, meaning the Bnei Esav. But more important than that, I think, is an insight of Rav Meir Simcha to Perek Lamed Zayin, Pasuk Chavav. Let me just get the page open here. Okay, in my edition, again, you don't have the same edition probably, but it's on Reish Pei Hey. Okay. You recall that perhaps one of the darkest moments in the history of Yehuda is Ma'betza ki naragas achinu, and Yehuda votes and advises his brothers to throw Yosef into the bar. And here, Rav Meir Simcha quotes a statement of the great Tana Rabbi Meir, quoted in Sanhedrin Vav Amud Beis, interpreting a pasuk in Tehillim Perek Yud, Ubotzea berech noatz Hashem. Somebody gave a blessing. David HaMelech doesn't tell us who, and noatz Hashem. It's arrogance. It's blasphemy against God. What does that mean? Rabbi Meir says it's an allusion to someone who would be Mavarech Yehuda, who would say, you know what? Let's give a blessing to Yehuda, because the brothers might have killed Yosef, and instead Yehuda convinced them to sell him as a slave. That bracha, an expression of appreciation to Yehuda for saving Yosef, is not, it comes, not means it's blasphemy. Says Reb Meir Simcha, what does this mean? He sets up a category called a Maisa Shetachliso Tova. Like, for example, selling Yosef as a slave, Tachliso, its ultimate purpose, is good. Because by selling Yosef as a slave to Mitzrayim, ultimately, after an entire chain of events, Yosef rises to be the viceroy of Mitzrayim and supports the entire world, saving the Achei Yosef as well. However, the machshava was a machshava ra. So you have, if I had a blackboard, I would write on the blackboard. The tachlis is tova, the machshava is ra. You can have a situation where a person makes a decision, he's motivated by evil intentions, but as it turns out, in a divine perspective, what he did was a great action, had a tremendously positive benefit for the entire world. That's Yehuda. Why? Because Yosef says to the brothers, "L'michya shalchani l'fneichem," which means that this was all a great thing, that I was sold as a slave, and now l'michya, now I can support you. However, and keep in mind also that at the Bris Bein of Sarim, Hashem already revealed to Avram Avinu Geria Zaracha. So this is all part of a divine plan. Divine providence has it that I should be sold as an Eved. So Yosef says, calm down. However, the machshav of Yehuda was l'ra'ah. Yehuda was unaware of the fact that this is a great, a stepping stone projecting the entire providence of God. Says Reb Meir Simcha, we have a principle called Avera Goreris Avera. However, Reb Meir Simcha adds another word. That's his own kiddush. Kidugma sa. You start with one Avera, and it leads to another Avera, and the second Avera is Kidugma sa. It's a spitting image, so to speak. It's a mirror image of the first Avera. What's the second major dark spot in the history of Yehuda? It's the mice of Tamar. Once again, says Reb Meir Simcha, we have the same equation. The tachlis is l'tova, and the maisa is l'ra. It says vayeshevel l'zona, and the passions got the best of him, and Yehuda had a relationship with this zona. Ki kissed her paneh, she covered her face. V'nolad mizeh malchei Yisrael. As a result, we get David HaMelech through, he's Amadu Moav, and from Rus HaMoavayat, so and so on, until finally we end up with David HaMelech. So once again, the Avera of Yehuda is a machshava ra, but a tachlis tova. Great things come out of this Avera. What Rabbi Meir wants to teach us in Meshech Sanhedrin, applying the principle of Me'etz Hashem, is that don't bestow blessings on people just because their ill-intended actions and their criminal record led to some greater good and a wonderful tachlis. Don't be fooled by that, because that's Me'etz Hashem. God will punish those who have bad intentions. And therefore, Reb Meir Simcha here in the Meshech Chochma, in Parshat VaYechi, says that if, let's say, you think you're eating non-kosher food, and you went ahead and you ate it, It turned out, as luck would have it, it was basa tle, it was kosher meat. The Torah says you need kapara for that because you had a bad intention. The maisa was okay. It was parva, so to speak. It was kosher, but the intention was evil. And therefore, Mavareches Abotzea Ze Yehuda. That's Yehuda, and that's the dark side of Yehuda. Now we move on. Just 1 second here. Just trying to juggle all these farim. I have to find a better solution. Okay. We're going to open up now to Brachus Memtes Pasuk Ches. This is the blessing that Yaakov in Parshat VaYechi bestows upon Yehuda. Yodecha be'oref oivecha yishtachavu lecha b'nei avicha. If you happen to have I just said I can't juggle all this farm. If you happen to have a chumash with an English translation, you know what? I'll get it myself. Judah, as for you, your brothers will acknowledge you. Your hand will be at the nape of your enemies, and your father's sons will prostrate themselves to you. Rabbi Simcha quotes a Tosefta in Meshech Brachos. Yaakov Avinu is bestowing upon Yehuda Malchus, kingship. And the question always arises, why is Yehuda singled out for Malchus? And the Tosefta in Brachos offers an answer. I'll read to you the language of the Tosefta in Brachos. According to one opinion, Yehuda publicly humiliated himself when he confessed his crime with Tamar, publicly. And another opinion is okay. Rabbi Simcha wants to add a new dimension, a new perspective. He says, "B'tosefta brachas nemru taimim v'pneima zacha Yehuda l'malchus v'ayin sham." Check it out. For Ulai, however, he says, I would like to suggest an additional reason as to why Yehuda was zoche to malchus. And what we're going to see here is that in Rabbi Simcha's perspective, the choice of Yehuda was not solely based on Yehuda as an individual, but rather on Shevet Yehuda. And we're going to look at the way Shevet Yehuda develops throughout history. Ki b'Shmuel Aleph Perek Tes Vav, Vayishama Shol Es Ha'am. We're talking about the battle against Amalek. And Shaul, the king, calls out to the people, Vayifkedem b'Tlaim, and he counts them. Tlaim, I guess each one had to give an animal. And Masayim Elef Ragliva Seres Alofim each Yehuda. Now, the Tanakh goes out of its way to emphasize that amongst the military groups, the battalions that went out to beat Amalek, there were alafim, aseres alafim from each Yehuda. Now, if we look at that perek in Shmuel Aleph, it says, Vayachmol Shol v'ha'am. You remember the great sin of Shaul, that they had compassion, and instead of destroying Amalek, which was a tremendous opportunity, they messed up. And they killed the males, not the females. They killed the older people, the adults, not the children. They didn't kill Agag, and so forth and so on. But the pasuk says, Ha'am, that it wasn't just Shaul that had compassion, but it was also the people. Says Rameir Simcha, an amazing chiddush. The word Ha'am refers to those battalions that came from the other Shvatim other than Yehuda. And that's why initially the Tanakh goes out of its way to have a separate count for the soldiers that came from Shevet Yehuda, because Ha'am Chamal, Aval Anshe Yehuda Echrima below Chemla. The members of Shevet Yehuda went out to destroy Amalek without any compassion or mercy. Lachen, Kevan Shelo Chatu B'Amalek, because the descendants of Yehuda at the time of the great battle against Amalek did not sin, they didn't show any chemla. Hichrimam below chemla is Zacha b'Malchus. Interesting. The bracha of Yaakov is Ruach HaKodesh, anticipating what's going to happen generations down the line with the Bnei Yehuda, that they won't sin at the episode of Milchemes Amalek. V'nacham, very rare that Rameir Simcha comes up with a brand new chiddush, and he gives himself a grade. V'nacham. And now he wants to fit this back into our pasuk that we read here, the blessing of Yaakov for Yehuda. Zeu sha'amar mishum yodcha bi'oref oivecha. Right, your hand is in the nape, in the oref, the back of the neck of your enemy. What does that mean? Shelo tachmol ala molek. That's going to express itself, manifest itself in the fact that you will have no compassion on Molech. You just keep going and attack him. Now we shed a new light on the end of the pasuk. Yishtachu lecha bnei avicha, which means that your brothers will have tremendous awe and respect for you. You're a warrior, you're persistent, you get the job done with an absolute commitment. That's the makings of a king. And the brothers admitted it when they saw that the Shivtei, the Anshe Shivtei, Yehuda would not have any chemla on Amalek. They would go to the end to destroy Amalek. That's Malchus. V'zeu shtei mitzvos. And now we can shed a new light, says Rameir Simcha, on a Gemara in Sanhedrin that speaks about the mitzvos that are connected to each other, that will be emerge as obligatory when we enter into the land of Israel. These two mitzvahs go together to destroy Amalek and to appoint a king. He who has fearlessly and with great resolve destroy Amalek, he deserves to be the king. Amazing chiddush here in Parshat VaYechi of Rameir Simcha. Now we move on to Yisachar and Zvulun, which is here in Perek Mem Tes, and Zvulun is in Pasuk Yud Gimel, and then we have Yisachar in Psukim Yudalid and Tesva. So let's read Pasuk Tesvav. I'll quickly read the English, just to save a little time. He saw a resting place, that it was good, and the land that it was pleasant, and he bent his shoulder to bear the burdens, and he became an indentured laborer. The last three words in this pasuk, and he became an indentured laborer, don't seem to fit into any perspective. The entire thrust of this pasuk is to indicate how great Yisachar is. The land is pleasant, he bent his shoulder, he bears burdens, and now he becomes an indentured laborer. What's that all about? Says Rabbi Simcha, it's the very next piece here in Parshat VaYechi, Pirush, Yavodaso b'Torah. Yisachar will dedicate all of his energies to the study of Torah. And this is indicated by Rashi here in Parshat VaYechi on the pasuk, Yisachar chamor goren, shesovel, Rashi says, Ol HaTorah. Vayet shichmo lisbol, Ol HaTorah. So what does it mean, Vayehi lamas oved, an indentured servitude? No say mimena mas lizvulin. The Gemara tells us, and it's very explicit in the Medrash, that Zvulun and Yisachar had a partnership. Zvulun would go out and bring in the money, and he would support his brother Yisachar, who would dedicate himself day and night to the study of Torah. There's no freebie. Says Rabbi Simcha, Yisachar now has to give half of the reward that he gains for the study of Torah and pay up Zvulun for supporting it. And that's what's called Vayehi lamas oved. It's like a tax. If you earn a living because you're a laborer and you get wages, now you have to take some of those wages and pay a tax for it. K'moshe darshu zal ala pasuk tzmach zvulun b'tzeisecha v'yisachar b'olecha. On that pasuk, the Medrash interprets it that Zvulun v'Yisachar asu shutfis. In a partnership agreement, the profits are meant to be divided amongst the partners, right? That's why people buy stocks. Zvulun lechof yamim yishkon v'yotze leprakmatio b'sfinos. So Zvulun goes out with the ships, and he's in the import-export business, umistaker, and he makes a lot of schar, he makes a lot of money. But no saying l'toch piv shal Yisachar, and he feeds Yisachar. I never understood this language of l'toch piv. I guess it's a dramatic way of saying that anything that Yisachar could eat to sustain himself came from Zvulun. Vehem yoshvim v'yoskim b'Torah, and the Yisachar are dedicating themselves day and night to the study of Torah. Lefichach hikdim Zvulun liSachar. Why is it that the bracha begins with Zvulun and then goes to Yisachar? The answer is because Torah shall Yisachar al yidei Zvulun oisa. Any Torah that Yisachar was able to learn, it was a result of Zvulun's support for him. Says Rabbi Simcha, ubisota, that's a Gemara Daf Chaf Aleph, Kishimon achi Azariah. Shimon is called the brother of Azariah. What does that mean? So the Gemara says, what does it mean in Shir Hashirim Boz Yavuzulo? Amar Ula Lo Kishimon achi Azariah. One of the Tanoim in the Mishnah. It's quoted, by the way, Meshech Zvachim. And he was one who studied Torah, al yidei achiv shaya osek b'prakmatya, because his brother Azariah, very nice name, supported him b'prakmatya. Kidei sheyachlok b'schus limudo shel Shimon. The Medrash of Ula, quoted in the Gemara itself, in Sota, is explicit, it's outspoken about the fact that the schus Limudo Shel Shimon would be divided up amongst the two brothers. Shimon would get half, and Zvulun would get half. Pretty good deal. Lekach nikral shem Azariah achiv. That's why Shimon is called the brother of Azariah, because if not for Azariah, there's no Torah. Shimon can't study Torah except for the fact that Azariah is supporting him. And Rabbi Simcha is emphasizing here in our parsha that the partnership between the arrangement or the agreement between Yisachar and Zvulun is not a one-way street. It's not just that Zvulun is going to support Yisachar as a freebie, but rather Yisachar is also going to have to give something to Zvulun. And what is he going to give to Zvulun? The answer is he'll give him the schus of his Torah. And that's the mas, that's the so-called tax, which which Yisachar has to pay Zvulun. Interesting pshat. Very original light on this pasuk Vayehi Lamas Oved. So we've seen things about the greatness of Yehuda, some of the difficulties and the nephilos of Yehuda. Now we see something about the greatness of Yisachar together with Zvulun. And that's what we saw over here. Okay. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about Binyamin. Again, if we had time, we'd go through all the Yidei Shvatim from the perspective of Reb Meir Simcha. First of all, I want to point out, and if we had more time, again, this would be a subject unto itself, that the Beis HaMikdash was built, to some extent at least, in the Nachla of Shevet Binyamin. Why was Binyamin Zoche to the Shechina of the Beis HaMikdash? Reb Meir Simcha claims that Binyamin has special role in Kibud Av. Right, Yosef was gone for the meantime. The brothers were out there, in Dosaina. And who is taking care of Father Jacob? Who is servicing him hand and foot? It was Binyamin. But that schus of Kibud Av, Binyamin was singled out for the Shechina of the Beis HaMikdash. And I just want to add one idea of my own, which I hope Rabbi Simcha would give me an approval to, and that is the Gemara tells us in Kiddushin about the various manifestations of the Amoraim, different Amoraim of Kibud Av Ha'em. And the Gemara tells us about Rabbi Tarfon, that when he heard the pitter-patter of his mother, that she was approaching, he would stand. And he proclaimed, Ekum Kami Shchinta. I'm standing in front of the Shechina. So it's interesting that Shechina is B'lashon Nekeva, and he stood for his mother because of the Shechina. That means a mother represents the Shechina. The Shechina is always that dimension of divinity that has a close relationship with Klal Yisrael. The Shechina will console Klal Yisrael. The Shechina will pray on behalf of Klal Yisrael. That's a mother figure. The love and the compassion of a mother for a child. Binyamin, insofar as he was the excellent, outstanding member of Shvatim in the area of Kibud Av Ha'em, therefore, he was Zocher to the Shechina in the Nachla of Eretz Yisrael. But that's not the point of Reb Meir Simcha that I wanted to share with you. There are two other pieces that I found in Reb Meir Simcha about Binyamin. One of them I did not really understand fully, and I'm hoping that you'll help me with this. We'll learn it together as a chavrusa. And there's another which I think I really do understand. The first one, which again I need your help on, is a quote from the Yushalmi in a chapter of Elu Nemarim, which is in Meshech. So what we want to do now is open up to Bereshis Perek Chav Ches, Pasuk Yud. 1 second. Give me a minute to get the page. I made a note to myself. It's on page tough. Yes, just 1 second. Oh, here it is. Now, this chapter, Shmos Chav Ches, deals with, amongst other things, in the Mishkan, the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol, the ephod upon which there were avnei ephod. You remember that stones, one stone corresponded to each of the Yud Beis Shvatim, 12 stones all told. And engraved on these stones were the names of the Shvatim. Okay, then let me get out a Chumash. Chav Ches Pasuk Yud. And the Torah says the following: Eshev Afudaso, etc. The Torah tells you how they made the ephod, and then it says in Pasuk Tes the Avnei Shoam, Upitachta Aleim Shmos Bnei Yisrael. That's Pasuk Tes. Pasuk Yud, Shisha Mishmosam Ala Even Achas, Veshmos HaShisha Nosarim Al HaEven HaShenis. So the ephod is made up of 2 Avnei Shoam, which were worn on the shoulders of the Kohen Gadol, and there were 6 names engraved on one of the 2 stones, and another 6, the balance of the 12, on the other stone. However, Yerushalmi in Sota is bothered by a word in the pasuk. It says mishmosam. Usually, when a word is prefixed with a mem, it indicates partial. Mixas. Mem means mixas. Mixas mishmosam. And Yerushalmi explains that when it says mixas mishmosam al even achas and mixas mishmosam al even shnia, this is a reference to Binyamin. And if we take the name Binyamin and we divide it in half, we split it in half, we have Ben, Beis Nun, and we have Yemin, Yud Mem, Yud Nun. If you add those 2 together, you get Binyamin. So he says that on one Evan, on the shoulder of the Kohen Gadol, was engraved the 2 letters Ben, on the other, the 4 letters Yemin. Udrosh, and what is the drasha? Dichsiv, it says, Shisha Mishmosam, Mixas Shmosam. V'chein b'targum Yonasam. Now, I'm going to read to you what it says in Targum Yonasan. Shisa min ktsas shmosehem. So the mem means mixas shmosehem. V'lachein ha'yakosiv binyamin al shtei seifos ha'ephod. On the 2 shoulders that covered the Kohen Gadol, we have Binyamin, on both shoulders. How is that possible? I mean, there was one Evan on the right, one Evan on the left. But the answer is because the name Binyamin was engraved on both Avanim, Avnei Shalom, of the ephod. Lazeh Omar, and now, says Rabbi Simcha, based on this Yerushalmi, we can shed a new light on the bracha that Moshe Rabbeinu in V'zos HaBracha at the end of the Torah bestows upon Binyamin in Dvarim Lamed Gimel Yud Beis. Let's open up to Dvarim Lamed Gimel Yud Beis. In Parshas V'zos HaBracha, Ule Binyamin Amar, and there's a famous song about this. Yedid Hashem Yishkon Levetach Alav, Chofeif Alav Kol Hayom. So Binyamin is being blessed by Moshe as the Yedid Hashem. What does it mean, the Yedid Hashem, the good buddy, so to speak, of the Almighty? It means that Yishkon Levetach Olav, that the Shechina of Hashem will be hovering over Binyamin because of the Beis Hamikdash that's being built in the Chelek of Nachla Binyamin. And then it says, Ubein Kseifav Shachen. I mean, Rashi has a lot of problems here, trying to figure out Ubein Shchenav Shachen. That Binyamin is Shachen, he's like living Bein Kseifav, between the shoulders. What does that mean? Very ambiguous bracha. Moshe Rabbeinu for Binyamin. Says Rabbi Simcha, now we can understand what Bein Kseifav Shachen means. It's referring to the name of Binyamin, half of which was on one shoulder of the ephod, and the other half of which was on the other shoulder. So basically, it's Bein Kseifav. And of course, the ephod played a major role in the avodah of the Kohen Gadol. V'zeh remez noah. Again, he gives himself a little bit of a grade over here. In the note here of Kupperman writes, "L'kach shmo shel Binyamin shochen bein kseifav shel HaKohen Gadol, chelko, half of the name of Binyamin al Even Achas, shel kseifos ha'ephod, v'chelko al Even Shniya." But here, Amos, I need your help. If you can possibly add something to enlighten me. Why is this such a great bracha? The Yerushalmi is telling us that half of the name Binyamin was here, the other half was here, and this is an interpretation of the Mishmosam at the end of Sefer Shmos, but it's going to shed a light on the bracha of V'zos HaBracha that Moshe bestows upon Binyamin at the end of the Torah. That the name of Binyamin split into two becomes what he calls Chelko Achas Me'ak Seifayim, V'chelko Ha'even Hashniya on the other side of the Ktefayim. Why is that so significant?
That reminds me what you said about Yaakov.
Yeah.
Yaakov was not only for Goshen. Yaakov was not only for Bnei Israel. Yaakov was for all of Eretz Mitzrayim. Binyamin's attached to everybody when he's scattered among the Avnei Shalom.
Meaning the two shoulders metaphorically represent like the greater good of the whole, of something beyond, beyond being, what do you call it in English, provincial, or, there are those who are interested only in their own province, not beyond, but Binyamin spreads throughout. Is that what you mean, Chaim?
Yeah, it's also like him giving up part of his land for the Beit HaMikdash. The Beit HaMikdash becomes like the District of Columbia in the United States. It's not really shaykh in any state, as it were. Right. But it came from Binyamin because he was the Ish Klal.
Right. Okay. I mean, I was going to take it in a slightly different direction, but I'm still, working on this. This is a work in progress, I have a feeling that the idea of the ephod and the breastplate is what we call the choshen, is indicative of a direct communication between the Almighty and Knesset Yisrael, because whenever they had an issue, like for example, should we go out to battle or should we not, they would confer, the Kohen Gadol would activate the various stones on the choshen, and different stones would light up, and that's how they knew each word and letters, and they put the letters together and so forth and so on. If the ephod is playing that role of communication between the Almighty and Knesset Yisrael, then what's holding up the ephod? It's the two stones that are on the shoulders of the Kohen Gadol. And without those stones, the ephod is not going to sit properly on the body of the Kohen Gadol. And now the Torah says that we should engrave the names of the Shvatim on these two stones, 6 here and 6 there. But the only exception is Binyamin, because he's there and there. He's playing a tremendous role up front on the communication between the Almighty and Knesset Yisrael, because he's the Yedid Hashem, Yishkon Levetach Olav, right? The beginning of this pasuk, the blessing that Moshe Rabbeinu bestows upon Binyamin. He, Binyamin, is the sort of the receptacle of the Shechina. He is the Yedid Hashem, Yishkon, Miloshin Shechina, Olav. And that's an eternal relationship between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Binyamin. Binyamin is singled out in a very unique way, and the Mikdash is in his Chelek, and the Shechina is in his Chelek. So now, the ephod, which represents that communication from above, a connection between the Almighty and Knesset Yisrael, that is something in which Binyamin plays a major role. He is the paradigm or the leader that brings the Shechina down. Let's go on to one last piece about Binyamin. And for this, we have to open up to Dvarim, Perek Hey, Pasuk Zayin. The Torah says, Kabedes avicha ve'esimecha, kasher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha, l'man yarichun yamecha, l'man yitav l'cha al adama asher Hashem Elokecha nosein l'cha. Okay. So let me just open up Reb Meir Simcha, which I think I have here. Oh, so just give me a minute again. I apologize. Just the statistics here are a bit challenging. Okay. He says the following. What does it mean, Kasher Tzivcha Hashem? A phrase that appears in this pasuk with regard to the mitzvah of Kabenis Avicha, Vesimecha, Kasher Tzivcha Hashem Elokecha. We don't find that in any of the other 9 commandments in the Aseret HaDibros. Well, what's the Kasher Tzivcha Hashem? Says Rabbi Simcha Yesh Lefarish in the 2nd paragraph, Kasher Tzivcha Hashem Anemar B'mitzvahs Kibud Av. Why is it dafka here? Never like does Shabbos, for example, is a mitzvah. It doesn't say to be Israel nosaf al kibud ha'avos. In addition to the mitzvah of honoring one's father or the fathers, probably means the parents. Shehem molichim b'neihem la'atzlocha amitis ve'motzrim ha'mitzvos hashomaymios v'akabola midor l'dor. He says that there's a new dimension to Kibud Av as a unique mitzvah for Klal Yisrael, as opposed to the world at large that also share this great mitzvah of honoring parents. And that is that the parents are, in a Jewish context, in charge of guaranteeing the real success. What's the real success? By transferring to them the mitzvahs of Hashem. Lachein v'VaYechi. Now, I think we've spoken about this in the past. The Second Temple was a very difficult period in Jewish history. And Tzatz HaZadon, interesting phrase in Rabbi Simcha. Tzatz means it arose. Zadon means forces within Israel against the Jewish tradition. Atztukim, the Sadducees during the period of VaYechi, they wanted to undermine that transmission from father to son. And that's going to mean that there's something chipping away at our mitzvah of Kibud Av. The mitzvah of Kibud Av is now during VaYechi as a result of the Tztukim going down one level. Because we said that there's an important dimension of Kibud Av, of the Mesiras HaTorah, the Mesorah, which the Tztukim are now denying. Therefore, interesting, Avad Yishpeh mi Binyamin. This is based on Yerushalmi and Masechta Peah, and it also appears apparently in the beginning of Masechta Kiddushin. Where do we find a physical manifestation of the lowering, the decline of Kibud Av? We find it in the loss of one of the stones from the ephod. Which stone was that? Yishpeh, Yud Shin Pei Hey. That's the stone of Shevet Binyamin. Why? Why did the stone of Shevet Binyamin get lost as an expression and manifestation of Kibud Av going lower? Says Rameir Simcha, the Binyamin Oyemchabed Aviv Yoser Mikol Shvatim. He, Binyamin, was the outstanding personification and excellence in the area of Kibud Av. And he tells you to look in Parshat Tetzaveh, which we mentioned earlier, L'tachta Eshtei Avnei Shoam. And we said that Binyamin Kibed Es Aviv L'chein Sharsa Bechelko Hashchina, and therefore, Lazeh Omar Sha'afim Ein Av Morich Lo HaYedios HaTzotos Gam Kein Techabgenu. Now we can justify why the Torah had to add the words Kasher Tzivcha Hashem Elokecha. You think that all of your Kibud Av is a result of the Torah and the Mesorah, the transmission of the Torah from father to son, implying that if your father did not pass on the tradition to you as a son, then Ki'ilu Kibud Av Ha'em is no longer, I owe my father a gratitude because he gave me Hatzlacha Amitit. But in event that he didn't pass on to Minatzlacha Mitit and Taryag Mitzvahs and so forth, the Masorah, then I don't have a chiyuv of kibbutz. So the Torah adds, Kasher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha. Meaning, even if your father did not bequeath to you all the right Yedios Hatzokos, the right knowledge, nevertheless, Gamkin Techavgenu, because Kasher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha, Hashem in an absolute way commands the son to respect his father. Shata b'dor shabonim gamkein shomu piagvura v'einam tzrichim b'soros avos, and therefore, even if your father does not pass on the Masorah to you, nevertheless, despite the fact you are obligated in kibbutz av, and eino tzrichim b'soros avos, and kol pirish Torah shebal peh shomu pi Moshe, and nevertheless, afal pichein tzivcha Hashem Elokecha, which means that the original generation at the time of Kabbalas Torah, they heard mi pi agvura. They didn't need a Masorah Avos. They heard it directly from God. And nevertheless, Hashem says, Kavedes Avicha, even though you don't need to hear the tradition to receive it from your father, because you're receiving it now at Har Sinai. And that's what it means, Tzivcha Hashem Elokecha. And this teaches us that Kibbutz Av is not dependent upon whether your father transmitted the Torah to you. It's irrelevant. Okay, Rabbosai, so we covered quite a bit. We spoke a lot about Shevet Yehuda and Yehuda as a personality and his descendants. We spoke about VaYechi Yaakov and Yaakov's impact on the entire Eretz Mitzrayim. We spoke about Shevet Yisachar and the mas that he owes to Zvulun. We spoke a little about Binyamin and his special bracha, and Yiratzon, which bisocha, that all these brachos will be fulfilled, and we should see them behold them with our eyes. B'meherav Yameinu. Amen. Thank you, and have a great time.
Thank you.
Thank you.